Hey, it's 5 o'clock. Can you guys hear me? Wow. I can hear an echo of myself. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started so that hopefully we can get you guys out of here. I'm glad to see people are here. When I saw that I was speaking at 5, I thought, this will be nice. I hope both of them enjoy it. So there's this thing that happens to me sometimes, and I wanted to start the talking about this because it kind of helped me understand how I thought about creating this talk. Sometimes when there's a road that I've driven a whole bunch, and I've been up and down it a lot, like you may have had this, like it's a daily commute or that kind of a thing, and somehow I've never been a passenger in the car on that road, I'll reach a point where I suddenly get to be a passenger, and I ride along with someone else driving, and I find myself constantly asking them, like, has that always been there? Noticing ginormous things that are kind of embarrassing that I somehow missed. And I've had this happen a lot, and maybe it just says something about the way my brain works when I drive. But here's why I bring this up. About 5 years ago, I started working at Lullabot. Prior to that, I had never worked at a distributed company. I'd been at various design agencies and run my own small shop for several years right before Lullabot. And Lullabot's a fully distributed company. It has been since its inception. Matt and Jeff, who started the company, Matt Westgate and Jeff Robbins, when they started, I think one of them lived on the East Coast in New England, and one lived somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, maybe Seattle or Oregon. And it's always been that way. And now we're about 60 or so people spread out across 6 different countries and I think more than 50 different cities. And when I joined Lullabot, it was an interesting thing because I was doing the same thing that I had been doing for years, but it felt very different in certain ways. And it took me a while to start really noticing things that I hadn't seen before. It was a little bit like that, being the passenger for the first time. And so what I want to talk about today, and I'm going to fly through a whole bunch, but hopefully, even if you already know a lot of what I'm going to talk about, maybe you'll see it in a new way or from a little bit different perspective, kind of like that passenger in the car. And more than getting into a lot of brass tacks and lists of things to do as a distributed team, I'm hoping to give you a way to sort of, that's ominous. Wow. A way to sort of think about the work that we do and think about especially the work that people who do creative work do. And that's more than just designers. It's pretty much anybody who's not just doing basic math, I think. So hopefully the things I'm going to talk about will give you a way to think about the work that may help you as you make decisions, because my methods and things like that may not be the right thing for you. So I've found that understanding why we do what we do and understanding fundamentals is very important. So let's dive in. I think these 3 things are what I refer to as the building blocks of creative work, or at least I will in this talk. There are more than this, I'm sure, that other people could come up with. These are my 3 that are very important, and that's insight, energy, and focus. And in the next 30, 45 minutes, I'll do this as quickly as I can. I'll be referencing each of those things and kind of talking about things we do and then talking about those ideas. But I think these are a really great way of thinking about why we do each of the things that we do in the design process. And whether you're working in a collocated team or a distributed team, I think these are actually a great way to think about the work we do. How many of you, by the way, have ever worked on a project where a great number of your team has been in like different places throughout the course of the project? Yeah, that's like most of the room. How many of you have worked on a design team that was that way? Okay, awesome. Most of the room. Yeah, so after this talk, I want you to come teach me all the things you've learned, because I've only been doing this for a few years. Okay, so again, insight. I call it insight, energy, and focus as the building blocks, but I said for creative work, and again, I say that because I really do believe this is true for anyone who does creative work, not just designers. So even if you're about to make a new album with your band, like some of what I talk about here may actually be helpful. Fingers crossed. So let's dive right in. The first word, insight. I chose this word rather than another word that's often associated with the beginning of creative work, which is inspiration. And I think I chose it intentionally. I think inspiration is actually begun to have a little bit of a negative impact in the way that we think about how creative work especially starts. And here's an example. In the early 1800s, there was a periodical in Germany. It was called the German Music Journal. And it published a letter in which Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, you may have heard of him, he describes his creative process. And he says this in this letter that they published. He says, "When I am, as it were, completely myself, entirely alone and of good cheer, say traveling in a carriage, or walking after a good meal, or during the night when I cannot sleep, it is on such occasions that my ideas flow best and most abundantly. All this fires my soul, and provided I am not disturbed, my subject enlarges itself, becomes methodized and defined, and the whole, though it be long, stands almost finished, complete in my mind, so that I can survey it like a fine picture or a beautiful statue at a glance. Nor do I hear in my imagination the parts successively, but I hear them as it were all at once. When I proceed to write down my ideas, the committing to paper is done quickly enough, for everything is, as I said before, already finished, and it rarely differs on paper from what it was in my imagination." Now, many of us wish that we had this sort of inspiration happening on a regular basis, this sort of magic ability to birth something from nothing suddenly. It turns out even Mozart probably wished he had this because he didn't write this letter. It was proven later to be a hoax. And it's become a popular myth because the letter has been referenced as though it's not a hoax in a number of books about creativity and creative work. If you look at the various letters that he wrote to his family, the people that he loved, like his siblings and his parents and stuff, you see a young man who's expending a lot of energy in an iterative process, constantly trying to hone the work he's doing, going through frustration and just working until he gets the right thing. So again, while I love this word inspiration, I feel like that's the idea that we have when we hear it. So while I do want us to be doing inspired work and inspiring people, I think the word insight better describes a way to start the creative process. Now, unlike inspiration, insights are not something that you need to wait for the right moment for. When you're in the right mood or wait for some magical idea to strike you. They're not external. Insights are the things that we dive in and get started doing work to uncover. And though we don't have them necessarily when we set out, we know some of the things that we can do to begin getting them. And it's actually fairly consistent. And they're hugely valuable. Without the right insights, we may not simply make things wrongly, we may make the wrong things. In 1876, a company called Western Union had a monopoly on a popular new technology at the time called the telegraph. This is like the Morse code thing. And they were offered the opportunity then to purchase for a very, very small sum the patent to a new invention that an inventor named Alexander Graham Bell had created called the telephone. And they turned it down. And William Morton, then the president of Western Union, wrote this letter to Graham Bell. And in the letter he said, after careful consideration of your invention, while it is a very interesting novelty, we've come to the conclusion that it has no commercial possibilities. What use could this company make of an electrical toy? Now, we probably all have read and heard stories like this over and over, and when we hear these stories, we often think of them as the example of the importance of hindsight and not insight. But I actually think that it's just as much the latter as the former. One of the primary means of insights, and most of us are familiar with this in the work that we do, is research. Insights are what research should be all about, actually. Research is never for the sake of doing research or impressing other designers or even like feeling more confident about the decisions you're making. That's not really what it's for. It's for gaining insights that you didn't have before and getting a new inner mental vision of something that you can see more clearly so that you can have the energy to go after that. It's like G.K. Chesterton's famously said, the object of opening the mind, as of opening the mouth, is to shut it again on something solid. He was a portly fellow. And insights are sort of like the food of research. Now, I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about research methods in this talk because that would be kind of a whole other talk and not what I'm focused on. But one of the things I wanted to note is I don't actually think that the way you approach research is that radically different whether you're a distributed team or a collocated team. I'll talk a little bit about some specifics in that, but for the most part, I think the hardest part of research in any project that I've found is actually creating the space for it. Whether through scheduling or budgeting, it's not always an easy thing. Though we live in a world where user research and market research and analytical research are very popular to talk about among designers, and especially at like design conferences and stuff like that, the reality that most of us face is our clients either don't want to pay for it, or they, even if they can afford it, they sort of don't think that they have the time for it. How many of you have ever wanted to do research in a project and had someone say, there's really probably not time for this? Like I actually think that that's maybe more common than just they don't see spending money on it. But I think one of the reasons that this is the case is just often we truly don't have enough time, or we don't have much time, I should say. Most projects you're going to work on will have a timeline that's less than you could use and definitely less than you would like to use. And this is reality, so just embrace that. But we have to figure out a way to make that not drive us to not do any research and therefore have fewer and fewer insights that we're using to spark our creative work. It's Leonard Bernstein famously said, I love this quote, he said, to achieve great things, two things are needed, a plan and not quite enough time. And I've found that to be the case with research. I think a bigger challenge and reason for this tension is the perceived value of research, or lack of value. I've found pretty consistently that most clients are averse to paying you for a discovery phase. They feel like that's paying you to let them either teach you, or perhaps worse, that's paying you to write the RFP that you wish they'd written. And it may sound simplistic, but I've found it's actually just better to avoid the word discovery if you're selling design. Like, find other ways to describe those parts of what you do, research being one of them. And even research itself, I've found sometimes with some people can have the connotation of something that's very meticulous, tedious, laborious, and therefore extremely time-consuming. And so they don't even want to have a conversation about it because they don't understand that, well, we can come up with a scrappy way to do this. So just find other ways to talk about it. The truth is, very little time given to research is far better than no time given to research. So don't ever be afraid to get scrappy. And my team at Lullabot, we've gotten super scrappy before and done research really, really, really quickly and tried to find ways to get as many insights as we could by the time we needed to be starting making our first decisions, and then get creative with how you can continue the research to continue to provide insights while you're in the decision-making process further down the road. I've found that it's actually better to try to find ways to talk about the insights that you're going to uncover for and with your client. These aren't just for you. And so as you're selling this in your processes, insight is actually a great word. It's a great thing to talk about. It's about learning together, learning things about their audience, their content, and their organizations that they often don't even know. So tell them that. Celebrate that fact. Let me give you a real-world example of some little insights that became really valuable for one of my clients. We were doing a redesign project for an organization, and through a simple walkthrough exercise that we did in a workshop, which was like a couple hours, we uncovered a really valuable insight. This organization was a nonprofit, and it had grown tremendously over the years, kind of faster than organizationally they could keep up with, and in part through absorbing other smaller organizations. And during our initial workshop, we got all the key people together from their organization that sort of understood all the parts of their site, that made the content and did all this stuff. And we just asked them, walk us through the site. We'll put it up on a screen. We're going to do a tour. And with every component, every page of that site, we asked questions like, who is responsible for this content? Who here made it? If it wasn't anybody in this room, who is it? Tell us about them. Where did it come from? What was the process like for producing it? How did it get to the point where it was that we see it now here? And then one of the most important, who is it actually for? When do they use it? How do they use it? And one of the amazing insights, and it wasn't just for us. There may have been a couple people at this organization that had started to note this, but the key people who we really needed to be a part of this decision-making process had never noticed before that their entire website was organized around weird internal structures that were parts of little organizations that used to be other organizations. And every one of them had their own little section, but every one of them was producing content for similar audiences. There may be 5 different places on their site that a parent who was going to get help from this nonprofit would go to. And so we began to notice this. It was like not a eureka. This was like we did work together and found it out. And it led to one of the core design principles for the entire project, which was organize for consumers, not for creators. And I don't know how many times I said that through the course of critiques back and forth with the client and stakeholder group, but because everybody was on board with this and understood it, all had that insight, that intermental vision. It was amazing the way that it allowed us to affect change that otherwise could have been really painful. Now, I think that being a distributed design team actually has helped us be more scrappy in terms of the environment it creates for how we think about and plan research. We're not afraid to be extremely scrappy, using remote tools, work in really efficient ways that can provide as much value as possible really quickly. We don't have sort of an edifice of our process and our space and the things we do. And the other thing is it can be more glaring to us when we need to be physically with people for research. So to gain the insights we need, it becomes pretty obvious at the outset, we're going to have to get on site to figure that out. We're going to need to go, fly out and see if we can get, set up a meeting recruit some users from this group to talk to them, because it's just going to have to happen. We can't do this remotely. So there are actually some maybe advantages, but the way you think about it, I don't think it's that different than collocated teams. Okay, moving on. We'll keep talking about insight. It comes back in, but energy. Energy, I think, is one of the most underrated building blocks for creative work. The work we do requires lots and lots of effort put to bear over long periods of time often. Thomas Edison famously said, opportunity is missed by most people because it's dressed in overalls and looks like work. I know that this is one of the founders of our company. This is one of his favorite quotes. I really think that you can switch this out to say creativity is missed by most people because it's dressed in overalls and looks like work. We don't think of creativity in and of itself as being work, but it is. It turns out insights are often heavily related to energy. Insights are the spark. I was speaking at a conference a year or two ago, and I think it was the Bureau of Digital Affairs people put it on, and they did these interviews with all the speakers leading up to the conference. And when they interviewed me, they asked me a question that was something like, "What do you think is the most valuable tool that you have or use as a designer on a regular basis?" And very quickly I said, fascination. I think that people who are easily fascinated with how something works, why something happened, what would happen if, those kinds of things, these people are going to generate more insights in a creative process just over and over and over again. And if you can nurture fascination in yourself and in your design teams, it's a wonderful thing. Ron Miriello says it this way. He says, we're all naturally curious when we're 8 years old. But as most people get older, they become less and less curious. So they ask other people to be curious for them. And that's what I do for a living. And it's sad, but it's true. Children are easily fascinated, but somehow as we mature, we just lose this beautiful human quality. So if you want to get better at maintaining energy in your work, actually, find ways to nurture and grow your fascination with everything. When I was in college, I started doing this thing, and I think it's because my first 2 years of college, I was an introvert at a very large university, and so I was in crowds a lot and stuff, and I didn't like this. So I started doing this thing where I like to people watch, and I would sit, it would be in some place where there's tons and tons of people, and I would just pick people out in a crowd and look at them and ask myself, what makes them feel cool? I'd look at what makes her feel like she is it? What makes him feel like a total badass? What would he have to wear to where he would walk into this room and just feel like, man? And you can't do it without smiling usually. Like if you're in a crowd, I imagine you should try this, and it'll be quite entertaining. You might spend the rest of the talk doing this now. But thinking this way, I've found, is actually just hugely helpful as a designer. Find ways to become fascinated with people, fascinated with the people and the audiences that you're needing to understand and design for. It's one of the greatest sources of energy that we have. In the late 1940s, a man named Harry Harlow, who was a new professor at the University of Wisconsin at the time, he created one of the first primate labs. And he bought a building and a bunch of rhesus monkeys and started conducting all kinds of experiments. And PETA and all of that aside, one of the experiments that he did that I read about just fascinated me in relation to what I'm talking about. Harlow created a small puzzle out of a wood block with a hinge screwed onto the top of it. And to solve the puzzle, you had to basically release the hinge sequentially by removing the hook and the pin. And what Harlow wanted to know was whether the monkeys would take any interest in this thing at all. Would they just sit around scratching themselves and playing with one another and going after all the loose food that was always available? So he placed it in their cage and watched. And what he found was very, very quickly, their curiosity got the better of them. You might wonder, is that just the initial novelty of like seeing this thing in their cage? But it turns out it wasn't. Over the course of the first 2 weeks of the experiment, the monkeys played with the puzzles so much that they became quite adept at solving basically any new variation that they would put in front of them. And by the end of the 2 weeks, one of the monkeys could solve half of the puzzles put in front of it in less than 60 seconds. During the last week of the experiment, one monkey opened a puzzle in less than 5 minutes 157 times. So it wasn't the new novelty. Now, the truly fascinating thing to Harlow was the fact that the monkeys were doing this without any apparent reward. And that flew in the face of psychological thinking about the motivation of primates at the time. We're primates, by the way. The thinking was basically that if they couldn't eat it, drink it, or have sex with it, it would not motivate them. And that proved to be false. But it gets more fascinating. So after a long period of these experiments, I think it was over a year, Harlow had the idea to tweak the experiment a little bit. And he added a reward of raisins for monkeys who could solve the puzzle. And he thought to himself, surely they're going to get even more prolific. These monkeys are already way into this. I put in this reward, and they're going to be going nuts. They're going to not put these puzzles down. Well, it proved to be false. The monkeys got worse and worse and worse at solving the puzzle after the reward was given. And every time he continued to test it over actually a period of more years, the same thing happened with every group of monkeys. Creative problem solving got destroyed by reward. So you're probably saying to yourself, self? That's what I call myself. Self? I'm no monkey. I've got another story for you about humans. This is interesting. In the early 1960s, a man named Sam Glucksberg at Princeton University, he did an experiment on creative problem solving and motivation with humans. And he had various groups tackle what was known as the candle problem. How many of you have ever heard of the candle problem? It's an interesting thing. It's like basically you have to figure out how to get a candle stuck on a wall and lit so that it doesn't drip wax down onto a table below it. And all you have is, sitting on the table, you have a candle, and you have a box of matches, and you have a box of tacks. And the key for people doing this creative problem-solving exercise, the key insight is, does anybody have a guess or know what the key insight is here? Yeah? Yes. You can dump all the tacks out. You can use the box. But a lot of people never figure that out. Tack the box to the wall, put the candle in it. So Glucksberg does this experiment with groups of people back in the early 60s, and he told some groups that they would win between $5 and $20 if they solved the problems. Other groups, he didn't mention reward at all. He just asked them if they wanted to participate and try this creative problem-solving exercise. Now, that may not sound like much money, but remember that in 1960, the cost of a gallon of milk was around 49 cents. The average U.S. house sold for between $16,000 and $17,000. And a gallon of gas was around 30 cents. So that money was actually probably ranged somewhere between maybe $30 and $150, that range that he was providing. So it was a good incentive. What Glucksberg found was the same exact thing that Harlow found with his monkeys. The people who were told about the reward consistently performed noticeably worse. Now, I'm going to keep going here. The point is not stop paying all of your designers, all your creative people, because they're going to produce really crappy work. Surely there must be a deeper explanation. There's another person. Her name is Teresa Amabile. She's written some fantastic books. She's done a lot of research around how creative work happens. I encourage you to read any of her books. But she wanted to figure out what's going on with this seemingly detrimental relationship between reward and creative work, creative problem solving. And so she did a series of experiments. She began by asking children to tell a story based upon a picture book. So she had a book with only pictures in it, and children basically had to look at it and like live make up a story for her. Half the children were asked if they would do this in exchange for a reward, and half of them were not, and no mention of reward was ever given them. They were just told, hey, let's do this. The reward was they were going to get to play with a Polaroid camera. And to avoid the possibility that it was the anticipation of the reward that was causing a change in their behavior and their creative abilities, she actually let them play with the toy right away. So if for the reward group, she's like, you want the reward? They played with it for a while, and then they did the exercise. Just like Harlow's monkeys and Glucksberg's people solving the candle problem, Mabile had similar findings. All the stories were tape recorded and then mixed together and reviewed by a panel of teachers and writers, experts. The children who were telling stories with no idea of rewards were telling noticeably, consistently more creative stories than the other children, like markedly. Mabile followed this up with a new round of experiments trying to figure this out, and she added a key variable, which was choice. She got 60 college students together and told them that they were participating in a personality test as part of their course that she was teaching. She had the researcher pretend that her video recorder broke, and then the experiment couldn't be completed. So what she told them next depended on which group they were in. Group 1 was called the No Choice, No Reward group. They were told that the video recorder was broken and they were going to make a collage instead. Group 2 was called the No Choice Reward group. They were told the same thing, but they were told they were going to be paid for it. Group 3 was called the Choice No Reward group. They were told this video recorder broke. We'd love it if you'd be willing to stick around and do this other exercise with us. But there was no mention of reward. And Group 4 was called the Choice Reward group, and they were asked, sorry, this video recorder broke. Would you mind staying and doing this collage exercise with us? We'd love to learn from it. We'll also pay you for your time. And after the experiment was completed, Mabile had an independent panel of experts judge all of the collages blindly. They didn't know who was from what group. And what she found was fascinating, and that was that reward led to both the most creative work and the least creative work. The Choice Reward group, the group given the option to participate and do the collage, but also given a reward for it, produced the most creative work by far. The least creative work by far came from the No Choice Reward group. The group that was told that they now have to do this collage, also you're going to be paid for it. Now, how does this all relate to insight, energy, and focus? I particularly think this points to the value of insights for energy, and there are some specific lessons that we can apply to design teams. But again, insight's just about sort of learning and developing an inner understanding or mental vision of something. And Mabile refers to this in her writing about the research as intrinsic motivation. She describes her findings showing how choice transforms the role of reward in creative work, and notes that the No Choice Reward group is most like what most of us face every day when we go to work. Designers having not just the reward of a paycheck or a potential promotion or like they're going to win some award and the like, but the sense that they actually have a choice in what they're doing, that they're going after something that they're personally fascinated with. That's actually key to maintaining energy and quality in our work. So what do we do with this? If you're a leader of a design team especially, whether they're distributed or co-located, work to develop flat communication. Create ways for your teams to have a voice in the process of how you work, both the way you work, but also the work that you're actually taking on. In co-located environments, I think it's easy to take this for granted. It's easy to assume that you're going to hear the problems about the way you've been working or the new ideas from people. You're going to hear it while you're making coffee or while you're having lunch or while you're at the water cooler or whatnot. When I began leading a distributed team, there was sort of a learning curve for me. I began to get very intentional over time about trying to create ways to give our team a voice in both what we're doing and how we do it. And that's been a work in progress, honestly. It's always a work in progress, but some of the best things that we're doing at Lullabot in terms of how we work together are ideas that came from our team, not that like I finally learned at some conference or something. And this is a really rewarding thing for me, actually. And ownership for our team, I think, is really powerful. Like just like the research that I was just talking about, even if it's an idea that I've already been chewing on, if it bubbles up from our team, the way it gets implemented and how it happens is just so much better, because when everybody has that intrinsic motivation, when everybody actually, it's their insight, they have that inner mental vision, it's far more powerful in how it transforms the way teams work. We've tried a number of things at Lullabot to sort of facilitate flat communication. My favorite thing that we've tried is something called 515s. We did not invent this. Once a week, I send out an email reminder to the team asking them to remember to send their 515s, and it has a series of questions in it. It's called a 515 because you're supposed to spend no more than 15 minutes doing it and writing it, and no more than 5 minutes to read it. It should take no more than 5 minutes to read it, so that this is a sustainable practice. And it's not too onerous. But there are some default questions that we ask a lot, but I also change up the questions pretty regularly, because the same questions every week can get old. And so it's really important to ask good questions. These are some of the default questions that I often use, especially when I don't have a specific thing that I want to ask. I say, what's going well lately? What's been challenging? What are you learning? What are you excited about? What's one way that I could make your work and life better? And that last one is actually really fascinating. And the team is free to reply all, and our whole team shares it. They're also free to just reply to me. So if they really have an issue that they feel like is sensitive, and they're like, this has been really tough for me, they can do that. Our Lullabot as a company-wide uses a tool called Know Your Company. This is another way to just facilitate flat communication and let ideas come from our team. You can look it up online. Just Google Know Your Company. I think it was created by 37 Signals. It's a super simple tool. The really important thing with flat communication in general, is that if you provide no way for your team to actually act on ideas that come out of it, it can actually be like shooting yourself in the foot. So you need to both figure out a way for your team to be working with you to make your work better, and not just through telling you ideas, but also through like, okay, now how do we act on them? How do we prioritize them? In his book, Change by Design, which is a great book if you haven't read it, Tim Brown says, to be creative, a place does not have to be crazy, kooky, and located in Northern California. What is a prerequisite is an environment, social but also spatial, in which people know that they can experiment, take risks, and explore the full range of their faculties. I think one of the biggest myths that I run into a bunch about design agencies and about doing work as a design team is around what makes for an ideal space and work environment. And there can be a little bit of, snobbery around like space. Like, how could you have a design team and not have a big industrial building with foosball tables and a beer truck, and all kinds of hipster gear all around you? It's a great question. I've actually found quite the opposite to be true. Being a distributed team provides individual ownership of what space is best for each person. The real key is it has to be encouraged and nurtured. So being distributed also forces us to be intentional about when we're synchronously working together and communicating and that kind of thing, and when we need space to get actual work done. Those things aren't sort of natural as part of what you just have to live with because of the way the space is engineered. You control it. Woody Allen, one of the most prolific filmmakers and writers and directors of all time, describes something about the way he creates that I've always been fascinated with, and I find this really useful. I relate to it. He says, I found over the years that any momentary change stimulates a fresh burst of mental energy. So if I'm in this room and then I go into the other room, it helps me. If I go outside to the street, it's a huge help. If I go up and take a shower, it's a big help. So I sometimes take extra showers. I'll be in the living room and at an impasse, and that will help me. What will help me is to go upstairs and take a shower. It breaks up everything and relaxes me. I go out on my terrace a lot. One of the best things about my apartment is that it's got a long terrace, and I've paced it 1,000,000 times writing movies. It's such a huge help to change the atmosphere. Now, a possible pitfall of being a distributed design team is to think of space and mode of work and all this as something that we just like completely take for granted. It's like, it's no big deal. You can get up and work in your pajamas. You can not care at all. Like, it's this wonderful freedom, and that's really dangerous. You really need to find ways to both encourage, nurture, care for the space and environment you work in. and equip your team. Encourage them to do it. There are a couple ways that I've done this with my team at Lullabot. One is to just maintain a dialogue about it, to encourage people, find the spaces that work for you. I personally found that, like, basically anytime that I'm not creating something visual, if I'm doing writing work, if I'm doing review work and that kind of stuff, like, I have so much more sustained energy if I work either underneath my back deck, looking out over my backyard, which is like right outside of my office, or at a coffee shop. So I've even engineered into my schedule of my week big times when I don't have calls where I go to a coffee shop or I sit there and I do my writing work. And it's just powerful. We also use a tool called Yammer at Lullabot, and it's a way of like just check-ins. It's sort of an internal private social network, but we've kind of developed a culture of sharing where you're working. And this is part of sort of it being a part of the dialogue. It actually empowers the team to, hey, they're working at a coffee shop. I feel like I'd do better today if I went and worked at a coffee shop. It's good to encourage this behavior. Another way I try to equip and encourage Care for Space is to help my team do it for me. They're actually better at it. I started a monthly Inspiring Spaces Day, and we're maybe, 4 months into it since I started it, and it's been awesome. On this day, once a month, here's the rules. Like, everybody on the team has to spend no less than 1 hour, no more than 3 hours of their work day doing something to improve their work environment, their working space, make it better. And then at the end of the day, you have to share. We have an internal team base camp. You have to post for the team what you did. And it's awesome. We've actually had, I think Jen wound up buying lithographs that Justin had bought because he spent his time finding art for his walls, and I've started some giant flooring project because I was really sick of my office floor, and I was like, I'm going to spend 3 hours doing this and then 3 hours once a month for the next 4 months probably. But it's awesome. It's been a really great thing. One of the more common misconceptions about creative work is that the best ideas will usually emerge from group work, from brainstorming and collaborative exercises and the like. And while it's a good thing and it's necessary for the design process, it's not the only tool in our toolbox, and it's often not the best tool. In her book, Quiet, Susan Cain tells the story of a research group in Minnesota in the 1960s. And boy, keep pulling out research from the 1960s. That tested the efficacy of group brainstorming with professionals from the 3M company. Marvin Dunnett, who led the research, fully expected in this research, if you read the writings that he had leading up to it, fully expected to prove the benefits of group brainstorming with this research. The research assembled 48 advertising executives and 48 scientists from 3M, and they assembled them into 12 groups of 4. Each group was given a problem to brainstorm together. Problems like, I think one of them was the benefits and challenges of being born with an extra thumb. Go. And they would have to generate ideas as a group. And they did the same thing then with the entire thing, all individually. The results were definitive. The individuals in 23 of the 24 groups produced more ideas when they were working individually than when they were working as a group. Now, here's another thing. They also consistently produced ideas of at least equal or higher quality according to the rating system from an independent panel of judges that was judging it all afterwards. Also, the advertisers were no better at the scientists, which I found fascinating. So, if you're a developer, you're probably just as good as anybody else at this kind of stuff. The big lesson I take from this is not that I should never have my team work together in the same place or collaborate in these ways, but we should be really intentional about the ways we do this and thoughtful. What is it we're trying to get out of it? So how do we do this? Be really practical here and give some examples. Let's say you're working as a design team to come up with ideas for a given page of a website. Now, let's pretend you already have, you know who you're doing this for, you know what their needs are, you've got all the details you need. This is the point where you're like, we got to decide what's going to go on the page and how it's going to be arranged and how this is going to work. So you need a wireframe. And rather than doing brainstorming exercises with this group where you have a whiteboard and everybody's live doing a bunch of stuff together, try giving everybody pencils and papers and letting them work on their own. When we do wireframing workshops at Lullabot, I like to spend time talking through all the details as a team together so that we're all collaboratively on the same page and understand exactly the problems we're solving, who we're solving for and stuff. But then I'll give everybody a stack of paper and pencils, and we'll set a timer for like 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and we'll say generate the best ideas you can. And then in 20 minutes, we actually throw out our stuff on the table. Everybody starts looking it over, asking questions, talking it through, and stuff like that. The insights that you get, I've found every time I've done this, the insights that you get the very first time you even just see what other people came up with on their own instantly make you want to go into a second round, instantly make you want to, I hadn't thought of it that way, or I hadn't thought of that problem, and so you go do another round. And after a few rounds of this, you begin looking for patterns, seeing consensus emerge, and having some ideas that you might be ready to prototype. It's much, much more quick than trying to do some live group thing. You're using group time to collaborate and gain insights on the work that you're each doing individually, and I think it's really powerful. Now, you may be thinking, wait, you just showed a picture of people together. At Lullabot, we actually do mostly do this kind of stuff in person. We start most projects with an on-site. Even though we're a distributed design team, we almost always try to hold like kickoff workshops and UX workshops, wireframing workshops, that kind of stuff, as a part of a big week-long thing at the beginning of a project. But the thing is, like, you don't get to nail everything down in the first week of a project and then, well, glad that that's good. You keep doing this throughout the life cycle of a project. So, but examples of ways that you can know when you should be getting everybody together, regardless of whether it's a workshop or whatnot. Here's a few of them. Things that I've found really helpful to just go ahead, fly everybody out, get them together in the same room. Direct user research, strategy development. Sometimes those conversations can really benefit from actually live participation. Things like building vision and alignment. Some of that kind of thing requires synchronous conversation, and you need to read body language, and it's just beneficial. Building relationships. This is huge. Like, kickoffs for projects are hard to do remotely because it's the time when you are trying to build a relationship with the client and being there in person and getting to have dinner and all that stuff. Resolving thorny conflicts. This is, sometimes if a project goes off the rails, it can be really helpful to bring the team back together, figure out a plan forward. When we can't do that, we really feel the pain of it. And there's been times when we can't do that. And it's just like, oh, it'd be so nice to be able to just get everybody back together and figure out a plan forward. And then the workshopping that I talked about. For when you need to do the wireframing work that I talked about and you can't get together, which happens again and again throughout the course of the work that you do, we found that you can do this pretty well with, lately what we've been using is Google Hangouts. And like I said, I'm a real proponent of pencil and paper. I think it changes the way you think. So we've used Google Hangouts and this revolutionary tool for me, which seems so simple, but it's like a really inexpensive webcam called an IPVO cam. Together, we've been able to basically do the same kind of thing. Everybody stays in the Hangout during the 15, 20-minute break time, like you just keep the Hangout up. A lot of times, everybody switch on your music and meet back here at X time. And so you're there in your space that you can control and stuff, but do the exact same thing. One of the biggest temptations, I feel like, in huge pitfalls, and I suffered from this early on at Lullabot even, is this temptation to say, okay, well, now we're a digital company. Now we're a digital team. We have to find digital tools to do all of our digital work. And so we need an online wireframing tool, and we need an online card sorting tool, and we need an online this tool, and an online that tool. And it can actually be devastating to your creative energy, I think. It makes you start working in modes that actually are not as good of modes to be working in. A study in applied cognitive psychology from just a couple of years ago showed that people who were encouraged to doodle while listening to a list of people's names being read were able to remember 29% more of the information on a surprise quiz later. And Tom Wujek did a great TED Talk. You should look it up. Google Tom Wujek TED Talk, in which he talks about asking people in teams how to draw how to make toast. How many of you have seen this? It's a pretty good talk. Because the process reveals amazing things about how we solve problems. People in it draw all sorts of things in all sorts of different ways. If you're bored during my talk here, try to draw how you make toast. I just want to note one of the most fascinating things from this, first time I saw this talk, was when he started doing it with groups. And he said, okay, now as a group you have to, how to make toast. And he had groups do it, and he had group after group after group do it. Then when he switched it and said, okay, you have to do this as a group, but you can't talk, no verbal exchange. The groups that had no verbal exchange were able to do it noticeably faster and noticeably better. This is a huge insight, I feel like, for how we work together as distributed teams. Perhaps the most destructive, more destructive than the temptation to find digital tools rather than physical tools, is the temptation to replace visual means of communication with verbal ones. Words, by their very nature, are an abstraction layer around reality. It just kind of blows my mind to think about that. But any way you can find in your work to actually remove the abstraction layer, you're going to find your work gets faster and people communicate better. Hence this famous, client-vendor exchange, I don't know what I want, but, come on. I know it when I see it. Oh, that's not it. Oh, that's negative. Yeah, but that's not it. Yeah. So we've talked about insight and energy quite a bit, and I'm trying to wrap up here. Let's talk about focus. Let's focus in on focus. Remember the research project that I mentioned that tested creative output and quality for people who work in groups versus people working individually? I think a huge reason for this is actually the need for focus in creative work. We like to think that we're more collaborative beings than we are, and it turns out a pencil is a decidedly one-person tool. One of the huge benefits that you can find in being a distributed design team is actually, if you're thoughtful and intentional about how you work together, is the focus that you can gain from not having to be constantly in a group environment figuring out how you can work well that way. One of the biggest challenges you may face, though, is finding a way to have a shared war room. And this has been kind of a new thing I've been learning and thinking about a lot ever since reading this article by... who was it? Jake Knapp, about creating physical war rooms for projects at Google Ventures. He makes a number of great points. One of those is that our short-term memory is quite poor, but our spatial memory is actually quite amazing. So finding ways to relate the things that you really need to keep front of mind in your work to actual physical space can be really powerful. And this is a key thing for distributed design teams. Find ways to, give your team, make sure your team has lots of Post-it notes. You're going to have tons of knowledge that you need to share, and you're going to have digital tools to share the knowledge. Find ways to figure out what are the priorities, what are the things that we need to keep front of mind, your personas, maybe design principles that you've set out for your project, these kinds of things. Put them on Post-it notes around the space that you're working in. Find ways to do it in a way that you're happy with. That's the other beautiful thing, is you don't have to succumb to the hellish war room that is in your team's room that irritates you every time you go in because of how busy it is. You can organize it how you like, but it can be really powerful for helping you keep the things in your mind that you need to be. Also, just remember, related to focus, great design requires time. And in my experience, I found only two ways of dealing with this problem. Ask for more or focus on less. And you'll never be able to work faster in the present moment than you're able to in the present moment. So, I know that sounds weird. You can continue to work to get faster, to work more efficiently and all these things, but that never helps you right now. The only thing that helps you right now is focusing on less or asking for more time. It's Ron Swanson famously put it, don't half-ass two things, whole-ass one thing. And that's sort of a mantra of mine in my work. I say it all the time. I'm sure people at Lullabot get tired of me saying it, but I love that quote. So one of the biggest keys for distributed design teams is to find a way to create a studio environment. And that may sound really obvious, but it actually wasn't to me at all. It took me a while at Lullabot to figure this out. In a physical studio environment might happen pretty naturally. You might have critique happening regularly just through sort of serendipitous conversation. Come check out this thing. Hey, look at this thing that I'm working on. Even if there's a schedule, it's probably pretty simple in a lot of co-located environments. Let's throw stuff on the wall. In a distributed team, we had to find both the tools to do it, and we had to get very, very intentional about creating the space for it. Our design team currently has a weekly, most weeks, so here and there, depending on people's like travel and stuff, maybe it doesn't happen, but for the most part, weekly we do a show and tell. And so no matter what project you're working on, if you're off on a project on your own at the time, or if you're with a smaller team, everybody gets a chance to show what they're working on and gain insights through critique from other people on the team that may not even be on the project that they're on. Within smaller project teams, we do these sometimes daily at different points in the project for kind of long swaths at times. I mentioned Google Hangouts and IPVocams, and that's for that sketching work. We've really found that like once it gets into visual assets, like InVision app, they have a thing called Live Share that's just amazing for taking away the verbal abstraction layer. You can see what somebody's pointing to. You can draw on it, draw little arrows and smiley faces and inappropriate things. Yeah, it's a wonderful tool for distributed design teams. There's a great deal that's already written about sort of how to do critique well, but the most helpful thing to me is still in terms of how I think about critiques is that they exist to produce insights. They exist to help each person gain an inner mental vision of something that they can't quite see yet. And that comes from asking good questions and helping people. Insight means that the person that's doing the work gets this new vision. It's not like, this lightning bolt that's coming from somebody else's magic idea all the time. So you have it takes patience, but the most important thing that you can create, I think, within your teams to make critiques really produce insights and energy and therefore great work is trust. And it may sound really sappy or uncomfortable sometimes, like I don't know what your work life is like and what your work relationships are like, but when it comes right down to it, when people know they're loved, they trust. And you got to find ways to love people to have great critique. I know that sounds weird. Find ways for your team to practice gratitude. Encourage it by doing it yourself as leader or as a team member. Celebrate one another's accomplishments and be there for each other when you're stuck, when you're having trouble finding a solution. Like empathize, like we hear about empathy all the time for working with the users that we're designing for. Empathize as a team. You'll find that critique times become more and more valuable and go better and better the more you can generate that kind of an environment. And so to conclude on a sappy note, I just wanted to point something out that I personally think is fantastic about what I do as a designer, and that's that design is for lovers. And here's why. Design as a discipline is actually all about love, I think. You're trying to see things the way others see them first so that you can solve their problems and make their lives better using your skills and gifts. You do your best work when their problems become your problems, not because of reward, but because that's just what fascinates you. That's what you're about. That's what you do. And when that happens, you do it well. You have energy. So it may sound funny, but some of the same things that can help you have a great marriage can make you a great designer. So listen, empathize, maintain and apply your energy daily for the long haul, and don't let yourself get distracted. So stick with it. Hopefully at least some of what I covered has been helpful. I love hearing ideas from people, so I'm at jpunch on Twitter, and my email address, I'm jaredp@lullabot.com. I know it's dangerous to give that out, but I love getting more than 140 characters from people. So if you have ideas, things you've learned that you're like, you should talk about that in this talk because it would make this talk better, I really would love to hear that. And if there are things that you really thought were helpful, I'd love to hear that too. But thanks a lot for sticking around so late in the day. I think we have like a couple minutes if anybody has questions. So.